Thank you, Preben.
And maybe you can tell us what it is we're seeing here.
Yeah, we'll hit play and we can watch it happen. So this is actually the interface of an industrial control system and an electric utility in Western Ukraine called Prikopatya Oblenergo. I had to practice a lot to be able to say that. And you see here that the mouse is moving on this operator's screen, actually clicking on circuit breakers to try to turn off the power inside of this Ukrainian power grid. And then the person filming this pulls back his phone and shows that no one is touching the mouse. This is actually what we call a phantom mouse attack. Sandworm was inside of this network. But yeah, just suffice to say, this was the first ever blackout attack triggered by hackers. It occurred in Western Ukraine in December of 2015. They did actually take over the mouse movements of these poor operators, lock them out of their machines, and force them to watch as they clicked through circuit breakers one by one, turning the power off to 250,000 Ukrainian civilians in the middle of winter. And truly, I think that is kind of like the milestone that marks the first true full-blown cyber war.
So maybe I would like to just start by, could you describe a little bit further, what is this book actually about?
Right, yeah, well, this all began really for me when my editors at Wired magazine, where I work, day to day, they asked me to find the story of cyber war. They wanted to do a kind of takeover of the magazine about this topic. And I think that they were focused, as everybody was at the time, this was 2016, on the Russian interference in the presidential election in the United States. But that to me didn't seem like cyber war at all. I mean, to me, cyber war is a kind of sustained series of cyber attacks with destructive or disruptive effects in the context of an actual war. It's not just meddling with some politics and like hacking some emails and leaking them to try to change the outcome of an election. That is kind of just dirty politics by other means. So I went looking for what I thought would be like is there a real cyber war happening anywhere in the world? I knew about that blackout. I didn't have that video. I had to go all the way to Western Ukraine to get that video. It was airdropped to me onto my phone by the operator who experienced it. But I went to Ukraine and I saw that, in fact, there was a real cyber war unfolding. Just as I started to look, in fact, a second blackout took place, and these two blackout attacks were just two among, it turned out, an entire campaign of disruptive cyber attacks that were hitting Ukrainian media and finance, government agencies, just these relentless kind of destructive attacks that were using wipers to destroy entire IT networks. Not as complex as a blackout attack like that where they reach into the operational technology, the industrial control systems, but really devastating effects. I mean, they were destroying entire networks on a regular basis, and I think in a way that the West had not really realized yet at this time. This was 2014 to 2016 or so when I started to pay attention finally. And so I wrote this piece that was for Wired to kind of give my editors that was saying, yes, there is a real cyber war happening in Ukraine.
Is that the word you were using, cyber war?
It was. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it qualified at that point. There was a limited war in the east of the country, and Russian hackers, I didn't yet know who, but I knew it was this one group of Russian hackers, seemed to be trying to kind of project their power beyond that limited war in the east, that lasted from 2014 to 2022, to kind of inflict terror and to just cause chaos and make their presence felt far beyond the front lines of the war in the capital of the country, in Kyiv, where the second blackout took place, and even in Western Ukraine, on the other side of the country where that first blackout occurred. And so it seemed to me that there really was a cyber war happening there. That's what I wrote in this cover story for Wired. And the kind of thesis of that piece was also that we need to look to Ukraine to see not just the future of cyber war, which is happening there, but that these attacks, sooner or later, if we don't address them, they will spill out to the rest of the world. They'll hit us in the West as well. And it was actually the very week that cover story published that NotPetya, this piece of malware, hit Ukraine and spread to the rest of the world immediately, and ended up causing $10 billion in damage. You know, the kind of ripple effects that in the description that you were showing everybody at the beginning, like taking out, first in Ukraine, really carpet bombing the entire internet of Ukraine, destroying dozens of banks' networks, hundreds of networks in total, every government agency, hospitals across the country. But then immediately, I mean, this was a self-replicating worm. It doesn't respect national borders. So it started to spread within hours to Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm here in Copenhagen, and Mondelez, the company that owns Cadbury and Nabisco, and FedEx, and Merck, which was so crippled by this worm that they had to borrow their own HPV vaccine from the U.S. Center for Disease Control. Their manufacturing of vaccines was shut down by this. Each of these companies was truly just devastated by this. Like they lost thousands and thousands of computers each, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, each of them. Actually, Merck and Mondelez each claimed that eventually, I think, more than $1 billion in damage from this one attack. That's how you create a cyber attack that adds up to $10 billion in damage worldwide. By far the biggest we've ever seen, even to this date. And when I realized that this was the work of the same group of hackers who I would come to know as Sandworm, that's when I saw that there was the kind of the arc of a book here. And I set out to first to kind of try to chart this story, but then also to sort of do the detective work of figuring out who Sandworm truly is. Where are they located? Who are they? Can we hold them accountable for these attacks that had crossed really every red line we'd ever tried to set for protecting civilians from cyber attack?
Yeah, so the target was Ukraine, but it immediately spread out to other parts of the world, and actually back into Russia too, right?
That's right. So I think some people wanted to claim, it's still not really clear what the intention of causing that much damage worldwide was, and I've only scratched the surface of the effects of NotPetya. I could talk all day about what it felt like inside of Maersk when like every single computer in their headquarters was wiped, and they have like massive shipping containers out at sea that they cannot even track. They don't know what is on them. Those ships are arriving at ports that are completely brain dead, and nobody knows how to load and unload them. But it's still not clear if that was actually intentional. Some people have described NotPetya as a kind of a kind of cyber trade embargo. Like maybe Russia was trying to punish countries for even interacting with Ukraine or trading with Ukraine. Maersk had one office, in Odessa on the Black Sea coast, and one machine in that office was infected with NotPetya because it ran this accounting software, Medoc, this Ukrainian accounting software that everybody had to use to file taxes in Ukraine. And that is how NotPetya was spread, through a supply chain attack that corrupted the updates to that software. So because it was spread via Medoc, it did appear to be like perhaps trying to punish people who were doing business with Ukraine. But then it did also have all of these self-spreading mechanisms, a combination of a leaked NSA hacking tool, Eternal Blue, and then an open source tool called Mimikatz that, in combination, made it just extremely virulent. It could basically hop from machine to machine incredibly quickly within networks. And so I think it was probably accidental that it spread to Russia as well and caused hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage there too. We don't know exactly how much. It was difficult enough for me to get any companies to talk about the experience of getting hit by NotPetya. It took me fully a year probably to get anyone inside of Maersk. Maersk never officially told me their story, but to get sources inside of Maersk to talk about it. So we don't know exactly what happened inside of Russia, but we do know that they were actually the second worst hit country after Ukraine. So I think that a lot of that collateral damage was accidental. And it just, I think, goes to show not just how kind of vicious and aggressive Sandworm is or was, I think still is, but also how reckless and brazen that they unleashed this thing that even did massive damage to their own country. Yeah. But Russia won't talk about this kind of thing, or in the
No,
companies that won't.
So far we know that Ukraine was hit and it spread through other parts of the world, including Russia. So what is actually the evidence that it came out of Russia in the first place?
Oh, well, let's see. So it kind of is like a huge, crazy person's conspiracy chart with lots of like pinpoints and threads between them.
Does it sound okay?
But it begins with like the first campaign of attacks that led up to that first blackout. We could see in Sandworm's very first attacks, or rather, even when they were just doing espionage, before they started to launch attacks, that they, one cybersecurity company, iSight, traced their malware to a command and control server and found on that server a kind of Russian language how-to document, explaining how to use black energy, this Trojan that they were planting on all of these machines. And by the way, that Trojan also, in its code, had these identifiers for each infection, each victim that they were using, and they had used snippets from like lines from the science fiction novel Dune, references to Dune, as those identifiers, and that's why this group was named Sandworm, after this kind of like monster in the story of Dune. So, but from the very beginning, you could see not only in the kind of people they were targeting, who were Ukrainians, experts on Russia in the West, people interested in sanctions, and generally like the kinds of people that Russia wanted to spy on early on. But then you could even see this Russian language how-to document, and then let's see, like over time, we could see their malware kind of evolve. So we knew it was this one group. It was just a theory for years that this was Russia. I think ultimately it was only in 2020, after my book came out, that in 2018 even, there was an indictment of several Russian hackers who were involved in that hacking of the interference in the US election. That provided some clues that could be tied to the malware used in some of these attacks as well. And it all connected to NotPetya. Some of the same clues were in NotPetya as well. And then, so in 2020, finally, we saw the US government impose sanctions and indict 6 of these Sandworm hackers by name, and confirm a theory that I put into the book, which I had heard from several of the researchers who were tracking these hackers, that they were in fact this one unit of the GRU, Unit 74455 of the GRU, based in this tower outside of Moscow. So yes, I mean, I spent most of this story kind of thinking this has to be Russia, but how do we prove it? And only kind of at the very end of the story had like a theory of who they were that was only confirmed, in fact, a year after the book came out.
So there's strong evidence that this is not just an autonomous group within Russia, but actually supported by the Russian government. And still, you went to Russia to actually see if you could get into that building that apparently seemed to be the center of this.
Well, I didn't actually think that you can knock on the door of the GRU's office there and ask for an interview. I mean, the GRU, kills people for talking to Western journalists or leaking secrets, as we've seen with Sergei Skripal.
Off balcons these days, yes.
Right, or
yes.
or like eat poison sushi or whatever.
Yes, yes.
So I really went to Russia as in a kind of like sense of I wanted to see this place. I'd spent years tracking this group by that point, and I kind of, almost out of a sense of completionism, I wanted to get as close as I could to them. So I did actually go to a Russian hacker conference, 0 Nights, just to see it, like to make a kind of good faith effort to talk to hackers there just to see if I could I had some leads actually that did not work out. I thought I had found some individuals connected to this group in the private sector. But yeah, it's very difficult. Nobody wants to talk about Russian intelligence agencies within Russia. I found some people who were talking about selling, 0 days, unpatched vulnerabilities, even in industrial control systems, to these intelligence agencies. But that's really as far as I got. I visited that tower outside of Moscow almost just to kind of see it with my own eyes, because I knew that this group that I had at that point followed for years was based inside of there. And I don't know, I kind of wanted to just see it to end the story for myself.
So you were stepping into politics on a very, very large scale here. Were you ever afraid?
On that trip, I was very afraid. I mean, I certainly worried for the entire time that I was working on this story, about being hacked myself. I know that there's probably nothing I could do if a state-sponsored group as sophisticated as Sandworm, or really any of their Chinese counterparts, or God forbid my own government, wanted to get into my laptop. But I took all the precautions, encryption, and advanced protection on my Gmail account, and I don't know what else I could do. When I actually went to Russia, though, I lived the true paranoid life of with a burner phone, a burner laptop, no connecting to any of my own accounts. It's a very lonely and not very fun way to make a 2-week trip to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Because of course I thought that I would at least be kind of detained, and they would grab my devices and just try to figure out what I had, what I was working on. And after 2 weeks of looking over my shoulder and being unable to speak to anyone I know, I mean, it's a very strange kind of isolation. Nothing happened at all, which was even more disappointing. I didn't even get a good chapter for the book out of it. But I still don't know why. It could be, of course, that Sandworm silently did hack me at some points and was just reading my email to see how far I'd gotten. But I don't really know why I got away with. I in fact wrote 3 major magazine pieces about them before the book even came out, and I never seemed to get their. I don't know if I had their attention, or if maybe they even liked the kind of notoriety that I was giving them. Of course, the entire time that I was writing about them, I was also kind of trying to make the point that we in the West needed to hold these guys accountable for what they had done, that they had carried out these attacks on civilians that were supposed to be breaking any sort of norm that we set as for protecting civilians in the cyberspace. Starting with that very first blackout, that was supposed to be a red line where that is totally unacceptable for a military intelligence agency to be targeting civilians. And yet, when that first attack happened, the U.S. said nothing at all about it because it was Ukraine. It was sort of well, that's Russia's sphere of influence. That's not NATO. That's not the EU. And then even when NotPetya happened, it took 8 months for anybody to say that it was Russia that had done it. Although it was pretty clear within a couple of weeks, just to me, talking to certain researchers who could tie kind of the fingerprints of this malware to previous Sandworm attacks, that this was the same group that had done all of this. It took 8 whole months for anybody to even say that Russia had done this, and then 9 for any sanctions, and then, in fact, years for any kind of criminal indictment. After NotPetya, even, Sandworm attacked the 2018 Winter Olympics in Korea, and it took 2 years for anybody to hold them accountable, for anybody to even say that that was Russia that had done this. So I think that perhaps the hackers within Sandworm enjoyed the notoriety I was giving them, but I have done my best through the whole process to try to call attention to this and to make the West start holding these guys accountable, to inflict some sort of consequences on them, to try to show Russia that, no, you cannot do this stuff with impunity. There have to be some sort of norms and rules, and hopefully eventually moving toward a kind of Geneva Convention for cyber war that would make these kinds of attacks a war crime.
Yes, because it is effectively one country attacking another country.
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, worse than that, it's one country's military attacking another country's civilians, right? So that's totally unacceptable within the rules of war. In fact, I've only more recently, kind of come to learn that the International Criminal Court is starting to look at this. In fact, the lead prosecutor in The Hague has said that he will charge cyber war crimes based on existing international law, because it is not okay within the principles of distinction, distinguishing between military and civilian targets, or proportionality of, you don't blow up an entire country to hit one target. None of that. So on both of those principles, what Sandworm has done is a violation of existing international law of war. So I think that it's very possible they will be the first case brought before The Hague for cyber war crimes. I'm not sure that they will enjoy the notoriety that I've given them at that point. They may finally face some sort of consequence.
I respect that you're not a software engineer, but do you know the technique behind this? What was it actually? That piece of software that.
NotPetya?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, each one of these attacks was its own kind of incredible Rube Goldberg machine. I don't know if that's something that translates to word, but it's like a kind of incredibly intricate collection of parts, much more so than most cyber attacks. But if we focus on NotPetya, it had three main kind of pieces to it that allowed it to be so incredibly virulent and saturate networks to the degree that it did. First, it was a supply chain attack. The Sandworm compromised the update server of this accounting software in Ukraine, used by essentially everybody who does business in Ukraine or files taxes there, MIDOC. And then they managed to push out NotPetya as an update to that accounting software, so that if you had this installed, you immediately had a NotPetya infection. And then NotPetya was a kind of like intertwined spreading mechanism, Eternal Blue, which was there was a patch for this already, but many people had not implemented it, which was basically like a way to like spread between Windows machines. And then Mimikatz, which basically can pull passwords out of memory if they've been used on that machine, and then use them elsewhere on the network to spread laterally within a network. So with these kind of two intertwined things, even if machines were patched, you could then still sometimes get to them through Mimikatz, and the combination of those two mechanisms seems to have made NotPetya incredibly, just spread incredibly quickly. And then its payload looked like ransomware. And even when I first saw NotPetya, that same week that we published this story about, Sandworm and cyber war in Ukraine, I thought, somebody has just like launched a terrible ransomware attack in Ukraine, and now it seems to be spreading beyond Ukraine's borders. But it turns out that it was fake ransomware, and that was just a ruse. People tried to pay the ransom even, and found that there was no recovery mechanism. There was no way to decrypt your computer. In fact, it was just a wiper pretending to be ransomware, just as another layer of obfuscation that initially worked on me. It was only when I, to make this seem like profit-focused cybercrime, when in fact it was cyber war. And it was only when I started calling Ukrainians that they, having experienced these kinds of attacks for years, immediately said to me, no, this is not cyber crime, this is an act of cyber war. And they were right, it was in fact Sandworm again. Yeah.
And it came in through an email attachment.
This came in through a supply chain attack. That was really what meaning you didn't. All you had to do was have this accounting software on your network, and you were completely vulnerable to this. Their earlier attacks had, like the blackout attack, for instance, had started with a phishing email, and then they had, I think, used like they had stolen access to a VPN, which somehow allowed them to cross over into the, industrial control system side of the network. And then they used that incredibly scary phantom mouse attack. They took over actually the Citrix help desk software that the IT help desk would use to remote into these computers. And they used that to take over the mouse movements and lock people out, and then manually click through circuit breakers to turn off the power, as we showed in the video. That, of course, is probably not the most efficient way to turn off the power. And in the second attack, they did use their own custom-coded malware that's known as In-Destroyer or Crash Override, depending on who you're talking to. That was basically like an automated blackout bot that could sort of automatically turn off circuit breakers, like bam, 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 in this automated way. But I think that the phantom mouse attack did have this added effect of terrorizing the operators in the control room.
Could it be that this was actually just an exercise that went out of scale?
NotPetya, you mean?
Yes.
Well, we were talking about that a minute ago, and I think that some of it absolutely did. I don't think that Sandworm intended to cause so much damage in Russia with NotPetya, but MEDOC in every installation you could see the tax ID of the user. So Sandworm had the ability, if they wanted to, and maybe they did, in fact, to some degree, they could have targeted this attack perfectly to see exactly whose networks they were installing NotPetya onto. And you have to wonder, were they just so careless that they just installed it everywhere they could, and even perhaps some places in Russia? Or were they actually targeting companies outside of Ukraine? They certainly weren't targeting the ones in Russia, but were they targeting Maersk and Mondelez and FedEx and Merck? Were they intending ultimately to? I would say that even among those, even in the West, there's absolutely unintentional ripple effects too. They took out a speech-to-text software company, for instance, that used MEDOC, that did do business in Ukraine. And it turns out that speech-to-text software was used by hospitals across the United States to update medical records. So for 2 days after NotPetya, this system had failed, and many of these hospitals, dozens of them in fact, didn't know that the system had failed. This was a kind of silent failure. So doctors were reading changes into patients' medical records, and they were not being transcribed. And so when these networks of hospitals realized this, their electronic health records were still available, but they didn't know if they were updated properly. I heard, for instance, from an IT administrator at a hospital that like a nurse had come up to her a couple of days after NotPetya hit and was telling her, we have a child patient who's due for surgery. We don't know if he's had the necessary tests yet. Like, we need to frantically go through all of the raw audio files that doctors had been, reading changes into the medical records that had not been transcribed. And they ended up having to do this again and again, and racing to try to, update medical records in time for patients, sometimes with life or death illnesses, to get the care they needed. I mean, that kind of ripple effect is totally not predictable, even by the attacker, I think. So yes, it absolutely spun out of control, but I think that you have to still, I don't think that lets them off the hook at all. It was, they should have known exactly what they could have controlled the blast radius of this, and they did not, and that's on them.
How has this affected your life?
It's an interesting question. I guess it's made me more paranoid. It's made me think about the ways that systems fail and how to be ready to be resilient against those failures. I mean, Ukraine is now, I think, globally a model of resilience. But in this book, which came out, long before the war, the full-scale invasion, I did write a chapter about this notion of resilience, and you can see it in Ukraine because you could see it even then. They certainly failed to defend themselves. I think they're doing a much better job now, but they did have an incredible ability to bounce back from these attacks in many cases. When when the Ukrainian postal system was hit by NotPetya and its entire digital network was destroyed, they had paper records of a lot of like people's newspaper subscriptions, and they were able to distribute pensions, which is something the Postal Service does there, in the old-fashioned way, because they have kind of a foot in the past. And we in the West do not very often. We have like fully gone off that precipice into a digital world, where if we were hit by an attack like this, we might not have that kind of analog resilience. So I don't know. I think sometimes more often about like trying to be ready for that possibility. I guess, the first step is, think about like what happens when all of the ATMs go down and your credit card doesn't work. Like, how are you going to feed yourself? I don't want to talk about where I keep my stash of cash, but it seems like that is maybe one, that's just at least a small example of like how to think about that future or that, possible crisis.
So it's somewhere in the border zone between paranoia and a wake-up call.
Yeah, I think it's not entirely paranoia. It is like a practical thing to think about that could easily. I think a lot of people expected it to come, in fact, in 2022. That with all of the sanctions against Russia, they would lash out with another NotPetya, maybe more intentionally directed at the West to send us, to send a message to keep out of this war, to not to take a side. I certainly was expecting that to some degree, or trying to be prepared for it. I guess I didn't expect it entirely. I think it's turned out very differently. It seems instead that Sandworm and Russian hackers in general have their hands full in Ukraine and have largely left the West alone.
Why is it that we don't see or hear more cyber attacks now with the current war going on?
Well, it's interesting. So I think first you mean like in Ukraine, right, in the midst of the actual full-scale invasion.
Yes.
And there it's like a very complicated, it turns out, I think, in fact, that a limited war of the kind that was taking place for those 8 years from 2014 to 2022 was in some sense like the perfect context for cyber war, because, Russia was not trying to conquer Ukraine or depose, the regime in Kyiv at that point. They just wanted to create chaos in the country and kind of pin it in place and not allow it to move towards the West, and to create a kind of, borderland, as it's often, Ukraine has often been referred to, maybe kind of pejoratively. But once a full-scale invasion begins, you don't have to use these incredibly sophisticated cyber attacks and malware to turn off the lights. You can just send a bomb. You can just throw a missile at an electric utility, which is what Russia did do again and again and again. So cyber war has kind of fallen into like it's still, in fact, we've in the first year of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, we saw more cyber attacks in Ukraine than we've ever, in terms of sheer volume of wiper malware, data destruction tools, we saw more in Ukraine than we've ever seen anywhere else in the world in history. But it wasn't kind of at the top of our priorities. It didn't sort of like, if it had happened in any other country in the world, it would have been a historic cyber war of a kind that we've never even seen before. But in Ukraine, it's sort of like dwarfed by the toll of physical attacks on civilians and the refugee crisis, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children being like deported to Russia, and tragedies that make those cyber attacks kind of hard to notice. But and also it's interesting to see that Russia is no longer doing these. Sandworm even is not particularly doing sophisticated cyber attacks for the most part. They're doing these kind of quick and dirty data destroying attacks on networks, almost like just struggling to keep up with the pace of their own physical war. They have new targets, it seems, probably they have a new target list every day based on, the priorities of the military. And so it's not that kind of sort of perfect laboratory for cyber war that they had previous to the invasion, where they could take a year to sit inside of a network and plan the perfect attack. But I think you were also maybe asking about, like, why are we not seeing more cyber attacks in the West since?
Yeah, or maybe it's a bit naive even to think that this is something happening out of Russia only.
Well, I don't, I certainly write about any cyber attack that I learn of, and I'm not, I try not to have blinders on to look only at Russia. I think probably the last 6 or 8 stories I've written have been about China, in fact. But Russia is unique in their focus on destructive and disruptive attack. China, and China is focused on espionage almost entirely. North Korea appears to be focused on espionage, but also for-profit cybercrime, stealing money, stealing often cryptocurrency by the billions of dollars worth. So Russia, is unique in this regard. Iran, I suppose, has done some cyber attacks, but never at the same scale as Russia. The United States, of course, and the Five Eyes, as we call them, like the 5 major English-speaking countries that are allied, have definitely done cyber attacks such as Stuxnet that were physically destructive in some cases, but extremely targeted compared to what Russia has done, which was the opposite of targeted. It was so indiscriminate. So I don't know. I hope I'm not being naive, but I do think that in terms of sheer volume of cyber attacks, I don't think Sandworm is the biggest concern of the West. It's become ransomware. It's become these organized criminal groups that have kind of like, perhaps they have the tacit support of the Russian state, but they're operating on their own for profit and causing incredible chaos across the West. I mean, including here in Denmark and occasionally. And what once was pretending to be ransomware, NotPetya, is now actual ransomware, and it's still causing huge disruption.
Do you know how we managed to stop spreading Sandworm?
How do you mean? Sorry, how we managed to stop? How NotPetya?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah.
I think NotPetya really just burned itself out. Basically, every network that was vulnerable was completely saturated with this malware and was destroyed. And it was not a piece of malware that was designed like, if people remember, WannaCry, which actually hit the same summer and was when it hit in May of 2017, it was the biggest cyber attack by some measures. It was really a ransomware worm that we'd ever seen, launched by the North Korean government, it turns out. And WannaCry did spread from network to network. NotPetya was not designed to spread between networks, really. It was mostly designed to spread within networks. So if you had this MEDOC software installed, which thousands of networks did, then it would simply spread within your intranet, essentially, and destroy everything. So I think in that sense, it did its $10 billion worth of damage. It had these ripple effects, and then it stopped. It had saturated everything it could touch and essentially burned out. It was not like a true pandemic that just continues to spread and spread. We still see WannaCry infections even today, I think, although it was essentially neutered by this unintentional kill switch built into it. NotPetya had no such kill switch. It just did all the damage it could do before it burned itself out.
Do you know how they managed to recover from it? What did Maersk do? How long did it take?
Right. So Maersk has like a kind of a truly crazy story of recovery. I mean, their entire global IT network had been destroyed. There was no real way of recovering from this. There was no antidote. They had to rebuild their whole global network. And this was like at a time when ships were arriving at Maersk terminals around the world. 17 of them were completely wiped so that nobody knew what was on these ships. Tens of thousands of trucks were lining up outside of these ports because there was a kind of check-in system where the trucks would pull up to the gate and be told where to go to pick up or drop off a shipping container. And those gates were dead. They used a voice over IP system that had been knocked out, so that trucks were lining up in these miles-long lines at these ports around the world, every continent in the world. And yeah, meanwhile, like ships are arriving with tens of thousands of containers on them, and nobody knows what to do with them. And in Maersk's kind of IT headquarters in Maidenhead in England, they basically everybody was just told to go to this office from Maersk's buildings like around the world just to get to work in a 24/7 recovery operation. But the very first thing that they realized was that they had no backups of their domain controllers, which are, this kind of like important sort of piece, like backbone piece of a network. They had this system, they thought that they had a backup system because the domain controllers were designed in this redundancy system so that they would copy to each other. Maersk had hundreds of them around the world. And if one was knocked out, then it would get it would just copy its data from another one in this redundancy system. But they had not planned for a situation where every single one of them was wiped simultaneously, which is exactly what NotPetya did. So when they realized that NotPetya had knocked out every single domain controller they had in the world, from Maidenhead, they started just frantically calling all of their data centers globally to try to find any domain controller backup, and they managed to discover it, and it's a kind of miracle, that there was one machine in Ghana that had been offline at the time of the attack. There had been a blackout in this data center, not a Sandworm-induced cyber attack blackout, but just a lucky blackout that had meant that this one machine was offline and its data was still intact. So they needed to get that backup data to Maidenhead to start, rebuilding their domain controllers and their network. They tried to upload the data, but the bandwidth wasn't somehow good enough from this Ghanaian data center. So they tried to fly an engineer from Ghana to Maidenhead, but he didn't have the right visas. So they had to do this relay race where they flew. And I've recently learned that they somehow did this, I think, with Maersk private jets because they were so desperate. They flew.
So at least they worked.
Right. Yeah. They luckily planes were not falling out of the sky quite, but a Ghanaian engineer flew from Ghana, I think, to Lagos, Nigeria, where they did this handoff in the airport of a USB drive and flew that to Maidenhead, and only then could begin to rebuild the domain controllers and then finally rebuild their whole network. And inside of the Maersk headquarters across town, they were, it was described to me how in, I think, the cafeteria in the lower floor, they were just installing computers one by one, thousands and thousands of them lined up because there was no sense of there's no cure for this, there's no treatment. It's just resilience, you have to rebuild. And that is what that looks like. It's not easy.
So it's like the biggest Danish company may be responsible for 10% of the total Danish economy. They don't have backups of the most vital backbone. That's quite a story in itself.
It is. I mean, that's a story about resilience or the lack thereof. Merck, which I think probably lost even more money to NotPetya, $1.2 billion. They did have I learned from a source there that they did have backups, but they were hot backups, so they were connected to their network and they were destroyed too. And that may have happened to Maersk as well, but yeah, clearly real resilience is having cold backups, they don't even truly count if they are connected to your network, it turns out.
I'm writing on a new book right now.
I wish that I had
similar to this one.
Another story. I've written, two books in the last 5 years now, I guess, and each of them took years of reporting. My most recent book, which is Tracers in the Dark, that came out after this, really draws on a decade of reporting. So I'm not sure when I'm gonna have another one of those, but yeah, I'm back to work at Wired. I have a big piece that will be coming out soon that's I think my editors think it's about the size of a book and probably should have been a book, but it's not. No, I'm just back to magazine reporting for the moment.
So if we should conclude here with some good advice to the audience, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I think that it has to be, well, I think that there are really two kinds of lessons in the book. One is about this notion of resilience, and I think maybe for like this tech audience, I'm not an engineer, as you pointed out. You know, I don't know exactly how to build that resilience, but I do feel like it's a principle that maybe is more important than defense or prevention. It's like resilience is the way to be ready for this kind of catastrophic, future crisis. You have to be able not just to prevent attack or defend against it, but to bounce back from it. It's like, it's less about measuring the time between successful attacks, but between the moment when you go down and the moment when you come right back up again. I think that applies to ransomware, which is the kind of the pandemic of the moment in IT, just as much as it does to cyber war. And then I think the other, I don't know if this is advice, but it is the message that I want to leave everybody with, which is that we do have to hold the people who do these things accountable. We have to move to a world where there are consequences for these kinds of cyber attacks that threaten the underpinnings of society and put children's lives at risk inside of hospitals. We can't live in a world where these attacks are carried out with impunity. And it may seem like a kind of sideshow to try to hold Sandworm accountable in the midst of Russia's physical war, which has led to atrocities that are maybe easier to see and certainly a higher priority. But I do think that for the long-term, future of mankind, we need to also create this kind of set of norms that will protect civilian society. And that means that, yes, I do think that we should push the International Criminal Court to look at Sandworm, to hold them accountable as they would other kinds of war criminals.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.